But if we can introduce, especially if we're going to introduce maybe a concept that's newer to people or a little bit more confusing or a little bit more anatomically based, if we can introduce it to them in a way that's very bite-sized, or when they're doing something that's less complex in their body first, and then invite that back when they're doing something that's more complex, I generally find that it's a little bit more successful.
Welcome to Full-Time Yoga Teacher Podcast. My name is Reka and I am your host. Thank you so much if you are a returning listener. I really appreciate you. And if you're a new listener, welcome. Welcome to my podcast. This is a podcast where I interview other full-time yoga teachers to share their journey of how they got to where they are in their teaching career, and also the challenges that they have overcome to be where they're at. I also interview part-time teachers and also people who work in yoga industry but may not teach or may not teach a lot. So I hope you get good insight and also inspiration from these interviews I get to share with all of you, that you can too also pave your own unique path to be a full-time yoga teacher if you choose to be a full-time. I just have one quick announcement this week. My retreat to Nicaragua, which is happening from July 12th through the 19th of 2025, we have one room that opened up. So this room is open for either one person who want to have their room to themselves, or it can be shared amongst two people. So the price will differ depending on if it's one person or two person. But you can find all the information on the link in the show notes of this week's podcast. What's special about this retreat in Nicaragua is that this retreat is rooted in giving back. It's called Ethical Yoga Retreat because some of the money you paid for the retreat will go straight to donating to the local nonprofit organization that's working in Nicaragua. And part of the activities that we will do together as a group is that we will go volunteer for this organization. One of the organization will be organization that have after school program for kids in Nicaragua to teach them how to speak English. And a second organization I will be partnering with is Women's Empowerment Organization. So yes, we are going to practice yoga every day. Yes, we are going to enjoy the beauty of the beaches in northern Nicaragua, but we are also there to learn about the culture of Nicaragua, meet the people who live there, and make hopefully a positive impact in the community that we are visiting as a guest. If this is a retreat that you might be interested in joining, I encourage you to go check out my website landing page for the retreat. It has a lot of good information on there, and if you have any questions, you can always message me on my website or message me through Instagram. My Instagram handle is at rekayoga.com. Website is www.rekayoga.com. Okay, so this week we are releasing part 2 of the series that Karen and I are doing, where we have conversations about cues that we used to say when we teach yoga that we no longer say anymore. So these series are a little bit more anatomy focused, informative, and educational. But Karen and I had really fun time recording these episodes, so I hope you're enjoying it. If you missed last week's episode, we talked about shoulders and different cues we used to say about the shoulders that we no longer say. And in this week's series, Karen and I are talking about the tailbone, the sit bones, spine, and pelvis. So that's kind of the body part we are focusing on this week. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Karen. And if you have any questions about the episode, about anatomy, about cueing, or if you want to give us a feedback on what you hear when you're taking classes or what you say when you're teaching, I would love to hear from you. So feel free to always message me. I love hearing from the listeners. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy this week's episode, and I will speak to you on the other side.
Welcome back, Karen, for another episode of talking about cues and how we teach certain poses that we have evolved or changed, or we have decided to move away from older ways of doing things that we were maybe initially taught when we were a newer teacher. So today, I want to talk about spine, maybe pelvis and sit bones. So kind of, I feel like they kind of relate to one another. And I want to start with this one. This is the one I hear all the time. And I feel like I'm nitpicking. Whenever I observe my mentees do, they'll teach a class and I'll observe and give them feedback. I do that in teacher training as well. And this is the one I hear a lot. And every time I hear it, I always try to inform the teacher about this. Is flat back. Flat back, tabletop, flat back, halfway up. Can you have a flat back? Make sure your back is flat and straight. So those
Flatten
are
your back, straight spine.
Straight spine, flatten your back. Yeah, exactly. So, and I don't know how you feel about this, but I usually try to kindly tell them that actually our spine have natural curves, and those curves are important and it's beneficial. Everybody's curvature is slightly different and that's normal. So rather than saying flat back, I prefer long spine or elongated spine or neutral spine. But what do you think about this?
Well, when I think about cues, again, like this, I think I always question what the intention of the cue is. And I think in particular in halfway lift, it's because people are very rounded forward and they don't have length, like you were saying, in their spine. So, and again, I get it because I think if you say, and I don't think that this is a wrong cue, but I think if you say flat back, it gets people to, sort of lengthen everything out. But what I think that we're trying to actually get people to understand is axial extension or length in the spine. Technically in Ardha Uttanasana, it's when we have hip flexion. So hip flexion with axial extension. Yes. And I get, again, flat back, right? Because for some people, it'll kind of get them there. But are we actually looking, the question is, again, we're being nitpicky. Are we actually trying to get people to have completely flat backs? Because I think that it would be nice if we lived maybe more in a place of neutral. But again, neutral is going to be different for everyone. Everyone's neutral is different.
Yes, that's what makes it a little bit tricky about teaching this pose. And I have done, when I teach cat-cow in the beginning of the class, I'll say now find somewhere in between. What's somewhere in the middle for you that feels just right? That's probably Annie's word, just right. Find just right for you. That's what Annie
Your
would say.
Goldilocks.
Yes. And then I try to remind that again when they come into Ardha Uttanasana, this halfway up position. I'm like, do you remember how it felt to find that somewhere in the middle, that neutral spine where you're not too rounded, you're not too back bending? Can you find that here? Or sometimes I'll make them do cat-cow and halfway up and then ask them to find the middle again. So sometimes it takes a little bit, but I think people can create that awareness to find. And I guess it may be helpful if there's a mirror too for somebody to see, because sometimes people don't know what their spine look like.
Yeah, and the other thing that I feel like I see a lot in Ardha Uttanasana is people will look way forward. Mm-hmm. So then they're in actually a lot of cervical extension because the cervical spine, has a lot of movement. It's always like, ah. So the cue could be feel the top of your head reaching forward.
Yes. Yeah.
Top of your ears reaching forwards.
Yes. I like that.
Sometimes top of your head reaching forward, feel the, again, bottom tips of your shoulder blades reaching back. Some people might be like, I don't understand what that means. Sit bones reaching back, some sort of cueing too. I find that people respond very well to orient themselves to something in the room, external, outside of them. I definitely feel like I'm a little bit more of an internal cuer, and I just think that's kind of how I am. Like I love those internal delicious cues.
Maybe explain to listeners what's internal and external cues.
So an internal cue would be, it could be anything where you're just talking to the body. Mm-hmm. So
soften the front ribs down towards you.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the ribs. Yeah. Feel the bottom ribs hug in. Or like when you're doing halfway lift and you're saying to lengthen your spine.
That's actually a little bit more internal, as opposed to reach the top of your head towards the front mirror or reach the top of your head towards the front of the room. So an external cue is going to be orienting yourself to something that's outside of you because it gets you to move in that direction, as opposed to finding that action in your body. I mean, you're still finding that action in your body, but it's based on something that's happening within you. You're not moving towards an external thing.
Yeah.
And they're both great. I actually think a good class has a good mix of both of them. But sometimes for certain poses, I just find the external cueing is the way to go. And I would say in particular, as far as like lengthening your spine goes.
Yeah, totally.
Even just, baby cobra, kind of the same thing, like getting that length and then trying to have people feel that same thing in Ardha Uttanasana or even Warrior 3, Virabhadrasana 3.
Yeah. Totally. Like, I totally see a lot of students lift their chin forward, and when they hear lengthen or like in Cobra, it could be just Ardha Uttanasana. It could be so many things, but the chin coming forward, I think that maybe gives people the sensation of maybe they are elongating by reaching the chin forward.
And again, right? And that's the thing, because we're saying something, but people are going to receive it totally different. Yeah. In my Pilates training, my teacher said, a cue that works really well is tell people no wrinkles in the back of your neck. Now, I don't love to cue in a negative, so don't do this or no doing that. But it was interesting how quickly I responded to that when I heard that. So sometimes I might try to say, like, see if you can lengthen out the back of your neck.
Yeah. I say lengthen the back of the neck a lot. And another one that I use that, again, from my teacher, Annie Carpenter, she says, look down at your cheeks. Like, gaze down at your cheeks. She says that a lot in like a low cobra.
Yeah. And again, someone might be like, I don't know what you're talking about at all.
And, for some people, the tip of the ears forward might work. Sometimes crown of your head reach forward. But I feel like sometimes it just doesn't click on some people.
Yeah. And I think, again, we're trying to get length. So it's not everything needs to be perfectly flat. You do, at least in a halfway lift, I still feel like you want a little bit of that lumbar curve. And then you're long from there.
Yeah.
But it's also going to depend on where your pelvis is positioned. And that's a whole other thing, because then we hear tuck and untuck and curl your tailbone and drop your tailbone.
Let's go there, because that is another one I hear a lot. And every time I teach a teacher training, when I was teaching teacher training in Peru, I was, out of 3 teachers, I was the only teacher who chose not to, or I don't use tuck the tailbone and in the way I cue. Not to say ever, because there might be some situations for specific type of student that cue may work, but as a general, if I'm teaching group classes, I usually don't say tuck the tailbone. And everybody was like really surprised when I said that, both students and the other teachers that I was working with. So let's talk about tuck or not to tuck the tailbone. Do you hear that cue a lot, to tuck the tailbone?
I do, but I also teach Pilates, and there's a lot of there's a lot of things in Pilates where you're in spinal flexion and a posterior pelvic tilt, which actually does have you almost tucking your tailbone underneath you. But it's funny because there's not a whole lot in yoga. There's actually, we don't do a lot of like big flexed spine movements. And I used to say tuck all the time, because when I did a bar training, when I taught bar, you were tucked in. You better not be out of a tuck position. Like, everything was tucked. But it's so funny. What's up?
Even standing, you had to tuck the tailbone.
They just wanted you to be tucked all the time. But what's so funny is that one of my teachers who taught me there said that people started saying that their back was hurting. And again, it's because you're just repeating the same pattern over and over and over again.
Yeah.
I think, again, we want people to maybe be in more of a neutral position. I would say that's probably ideal. And I get why tuck. I get it. But because it's, again, we're trying to get, because, okay, why are we saying it? So why are we as teachers telling people to tuck their tails?
I think maybe they're seeing anterior tilt of the pelvis, maybe too much in certain
Too much
poses.
lordosis, yeah.
And that like I could maybe see that happening in, let's say, plank pose. And then teacher would say, tuck the tailbone. That's probably like more common one I hear maybe.
Utkatasana, chair pose.
Yeah.
All the time. That's like, tuck, 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 tuck. And again, I think it's because some people are probably have a little bit too much lordosis, like there's too much arch in their low back, but maybe they're just naturally have more of that in their low back. So for some people who have a lot of lordosis, if you give them the cue tuck, that might actually bring them more to neutral. But then think about people who have really tight, maybe hamstrings, who are then pulled into this already tucked posterior tilt position. Then we're just telling them to tuck their tailbones even more.
Yes, exactly. Some people live in tucked tailbone. Like that's their life. Like they're sitting all day long. They stand up, they walk, their pelvis is in already tucked position, or the tailbone is in more posterior tilt. That's their like habitual pattern that they have created from the type of life they live, or it could be the tightness in hamstring. So I feel like if we make a generalized cue to everyone to tuck the tailbone, like I feel like maybe half the room doesn't need it, half the room may benefit from that cue. But then it's like, then what do we do as a yoga teacher? Half the room needs it and half the room doesn't.
Yeah, and I think too, if people are like, okay, what's anterior and posterior? The way that I think about it is anterior front, posterior back, and I'm thinking about the hip bones. So when the hip bones are tilting forward, anterior, then I think about anterior pelvic tilt that's causing more of a lordosis or arch. And then I think about posterior as the hip bones moving back. So it's creating more of that rounded position. Mm-hmm. And you know how you were saying a lot of people sort of live in that rounded place? Well, in particular, if you have herniated discs, I mean, it's not everyone. Again, it depends. But for people who have disc herniations, they actually need to be, they need to be living in a place that's a little bit more anterior, because when they're in that posterior tilt, the back of the vertebra are opening up, and that's often where the disc fluid is coming out of. But again, it depends. Mm-hmm. We're also not doctors. But yeah, so tuck could work great for some people, and then it could also be not good for other people at all. So how do we get people to understand maybe what's more neutral for them? And I think, like you were saying, it's cat and cow is a really easy place to do that. Explore your range, see how arched you can get, see how rounded you can get. It's funny, actually, I just saw a video that said, you're not actually arching. So now I'm like, try not to say that anymore. But because when you're doing cow, are you actually creating an arch in your body? Because an archway is like this. So technically in cat, you're creating an arch.
Yeah, you are.
And I was like, oh man, wait. I don't know if I can say arch your back and cow pose anymore.
Sometimes I say like cow pose, like find your back bend, like find it. And spinal extension, but that's also, not everybody gonna understand if I say spinal extension and flexion.
Yeah. But then, having people kind of find a neutral for them is a good place to then be like, and it's funny because I know some teachers will say, don't even talk about the tailbone at all. I personally still like thinking about the tailbone. I like thinking about where my tailbone is positioned. So, you might get them into that place in the middle and just kind of be like, where's your tailbone positioned? Or where do you feel like your pelvis? You could talk about the pelvis, tailbone's connected to your pelvis. And then when they find Utkatasana or chair pose and say, could you kind of sense where your pelvis is in space? Like, does it feel sort of that middle ground like it did in cat and cow?
Yeah, I love that. Sometimes if that is the intention of the class I'm teaching, maybe intention of the class is for them to explore the range of motion in their pelvis, posterior and anterior, and then try to find neutral, which is going to hopefully encourage finding neutral, elongated spine. If that is like my theme of that day's class, sometimes I'll start them off laying down on their back with bent knees, feet flat, like almost like constructive rest, and ask them to do pelvic tilt, forward and back.
Oh, yeah. We do that in Pilates. It's a warm up.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, now find the middle, like where you're not too far tilting forward, not too far tilting back. Can you find your middle neutral that feels just right for you? And then, you try to keep bringing them back to, can you find it now in Tadasana, mountain pose? Can you find it now in chair pose, Utkatasana?
In plank pose.
Yeah, can you find it in plank pose?
Yeah.
Get a little, and can you find it in side plank? Like, we can make it challenging depending on.
Because I think too, depending on the amount of demand that you have on your body in the particular shape. So, when you're doing plank and your legs are these really long levers, you may need, and that's why I don't say tuck that much, but I probably still sometimes will say it if they're in plank pose, and I'll say, so if we're exploring what the pelvis is doing, and I'll say, notice when you get into plank, do you feel like, and I feel like I will even say, I don't use this word that often, but do you feel like you need a little tuck of your tailbone? You're not trying to round, but do you feel like you need to feel your tailbone reach back? Or again, you could just call back to what that position felt like in neutral in cat and cow. So again, I don't think that it's the worst cue ever. I just think it depends on if you're just telling people, tuck your tail as much as you can. Then you have someone doing chair pose and you're telling them when their arms are up overhead to relax their shoulders down their back and then tuck their tail.
What about lengthen the tailbone towards the direction? Let's say like plank. Can you lengthen the tailbone towards your heels?
Yeah, that's generally how I'll cue it. Or can you find a little bit more length in your low back? But again, that would be more of an internal cue, because what does length mean in the low back?
Yeah. I have said before, move towards tucking, but not tuck.
Yes.
Like
see, and I'm like, okay,
all the way to tucking,
Yeah. And I don't want this to come off as like I'm shaming people for the way that they're saying things, I'm just always curious, and how can I be more clear? And, sometimes I'll give cues and it does not land at all. And I'm like, nope, moving on from that. But if we can introduce, especially if we're going to introduce maybe a concept that's newer to people or a little bit more confusing or a little bit more anatomically based, if we can introduce it to them in a way that's very bite-sized, or when they're doing something that's less complex in their body first, and then invite that back when they're doing something that's more complex, I generally find that it's a little bit more successful.
Yes, definitely. Agree. Completely agree with you. And I think, like you said, tucking doesn't have to be necessarily bad. I just don't think it's a cue that applies to everyone in the room. And if you're doing private and somebody really needs tucking, then you go ahead and you can still use that word if that's what your student needs. But it's hard to generalize it for the whole class.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, what about this? Kind of move on to the next topic of sit bones. And it's very common for teachers to say, or even nowadays I see students already do before.
They just do it automatically.
Before anybody says anything, is when they're sitting down on the floor with the legs straight in front of you, like Dandasana, staff pose, you'll see students kind of pull the flesh of their butt out so they can maybe feel the sit bones on the floor. I don't know. Is that why people do it?
So again, why are we hearing this cue? And it's funny because we were just talking about tucking, because they're trying to get people to untuck in a seated forward fold, because we're doing technically hip flexion, folding at the front of the hips. So it depends. It can either be the thigh bone moving towards the pelvis, hip flexion, or the pelvis moving towards the thigh bones. So standing forward folding is pelvis moving towards the thigh bones. So hip flexion, it's the same thing seated, pelvis moving towards the thigh bones, but now your legs are fixed in space. If people have their legs totally straight, and in particular, if you think about where the hamstrings are attached, right, to the sit bones, to the bottom of the pelvis, and then to the backs of the knees, if they're tight and they're trying to straighten their legs, it's going to pull their pelvis into a posterior pelvic tilt when they're doing a seated forward fold. So then when they go to try to hinge at their hips and lengthen their spine forward, it's just going to be spinal flexion. It's just going to be, they're going to be probably already going to be in a posterior pelvic tilt, and then they'll just flex forward, which again is not the end of the world. You can do a seated forward fold with your spine flexed. It's all good. But I think we're trying to help people get more length in the spine, right? So I believe this cue came from like pulling the flesh away from your sit bones so that you can feel your sit bones on the ground and actually feel them move or tilt back so that you can get more hip flexion and forward fold. But if you have a hamstring injury, which I have had, and I'm sure some people listening to this have had, sometimes in the yoga community, it's lovingly called yoga butt. hamstring tendinopathy, where the hamstring muscles attach right to the sit bones. It's often because there's so much anterior pelvic tilt, the hamstring has reached its maximum length, and then the attachment tendons are the things that overstretch. When I had the injury, I did not need to be anteriorly tilted for 1 second. I actually needed to be more in a tucked position. So again, it just depends, but it's just funny because then you just see, because you always hear move the flesh away from your sit bones, then you just see people starting to pull their butt cheeks, apart to get a seated forward fold. But it's kind of like, I think one time when I was teaching a class and I saw that happen, I stopped and I said, hey, can anyone tell me why they're doing this? And they were just like, oh, I thought it's what we were supposed to do.
That's great you asked them. So it sounds like if you are a bendy person and you already have quite a big range of motion of being able to flex the hip into forward fold, standing or seated, maybe we don't need to keep pushing the anterior tilt, the flexion, the hinging from the hips, especially if you're already starting to feel that yoga butt sensation. And the yoga butt, it's so common. And if any, like I think Karen already said, but if at any time students start to feel a little pain,
it's like a deep ache.
Yeah, a little ache at the sit bones. It's at the sit bones. So like right or left, some people might feel it in both. But that is, we call it yoga butt, but like Karen said, it's like the inflammation of the attachment of the hamstring. And what I see most people do when they feel that is like they feel like they need to stretch it out. They feel like they have to keep stretching their hamstring because they feel this weird, tenderness. And it's like, oh, I need to stretch more. But what should they be doing? Like, how did you heal from your yoga butt?
Well, I am not a doctor. Hello. Let's be very clear. Let me just put that out there real clear so everyone knows. I'm not a doctor. Someone might tell me that they feel something there, and I could probably have a pretty likely idea. Would I tell them that maybe it's yoga butt? Probably not. Kind of depends on my relationship with the student. If they're like more my friend, you have to do bridges. That's actually what's recommended. So you actually need to not stretch your hamstrings. You need to strengthen your hamstrings.
Yeah.
You need to strengthen your hamstrings.
And it's
in particular when they're not in a lengthened position, like doing a deadlift, but when your knees are bent. So bridges, one-legged bridges.
All great things.
You need a little bit more. And I think that's the thing. There's not, if you think about it, there's not a ton of hamstring strengthening things.
Yeah.
Just like there's not a lot of pulling.
Yes, it's so true.
Yeah.
So true. I try to sneak in hamstring strengthening in my classes. I feel like, most classes will be mostly hamstring stretching. A lot of forward folds in yoga, but not a lot of strengthening the backside.
Yeah, and two, when my hamstring was injured, I kept hearing teachers tell me to bend my knees. But because I'm flexible, when I bent my knees, it actually let me move into more anterior pelvic tilt. So that's the thing. And maybe if we were worried about someone and they were so rounded in a forward fold, which I really don't think is the end of the world, but if we wanted to encourage them to get more length in their spine, it would probably be more useful for them to bend their knees and not try to reach for their toes and just think about, really creating that space or length in their spine as they go forward and just letting their hands land where they need to. But every time I would bend my knees, it would free up my pelvis to actually go more anteriorly tilted, and then I would get more pull right at my attachments. So I actually had to kind of tuck my tail and stay a little bit more upright and round, which is so funny because, I think we're led to believe like, no, you can't tuck. And even like we said, is tucking a good cue? It just depends.
Yes.
And I'm saying tuck for myself.
Yeah. It's so true. I think this kind of goes full circle around on like cues like tucking the tailbone or cues such as move the flesh of the buttocks from underneath you. It's not relevant or appropriate for every single students in your classroom. So do you say anything when people do seated forward fold?
It's so funny because I was just thinking about that. Honestly, not really. I might have them lift it depends on the seated forward fold, but if they're doing, two legs out in front of them. And sometimes I'll say straight legs and I'm like, wait, no. Any amount of straight that helps you feel like you can find length in your spine. Reach your arms up, inhale, and then exhale. See if you can just send your chest forward towards the front of the room. Let your head and your arms drop wherever they need to. And then that's it. And then I usually just shut the up. Trying not to curse in this episode because our first one had a language warning at the beginning of it. Also, I'm tending to talk less at this point, like in Paschimottanasana, because I feel like I've been talking so much during the moving part of the class that once we sort of get to the cool down, I really try to personally just say less.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I don't think I say anything about the sit bones or pelvis really in that seated straight legs forward Paschimottanasana.
I might say if you feel like you have anything going on with your back, you may just find it's better to stay upright today or not fold as deeply. And that's it.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like maybe with somebody with the really tight hamstrings, I mean, strap would be probably helpful. And even like legs up the wall can be like a really good stretch for them, you know, and it kind of, now their back is, they can't really round their back. If this is what people with really tight hamstring, they have to round the back to forward. Like you said, there's nothing really wrong with that unless that person do have achy back from doing that. Then let them lay down on the back and use a wall or have a strap and lift one leg up at a time. And that can be such a great hamstring stretch for them.
I don't know about you, but often when I have people using the strap, when they're doing a seated forward fold, they're holding onto the strap like they are holding on for their dear lives. And their poor hands are so tight. And I'm always trying to be like, can you just soften your hands a little bit, your grip on the strap?
Sometimes I say like around that portion of the class where everybody is starting to cool down, I'll say stuff like, where can you soften, or notice where are you overworking right now?
Where are you creating tension that's not necessary to create tension?
Yeah, all of those things to kind of invite them to like, hey, you don't have to be pushing and pulling and contracting and engaging all the time, you know? So yeah, I think those are all great tips. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's it. I think, you know, with the seated forward fold, it's funny because you know, I feel like I was taught like you can't have people round their backs when they do a seated forward fold because it's going to cause them back or disc issues. But I don't necessarily know if that's a truth. Like I was saying in Pilates, there's so much that you do in spinal flexion because it's important to be able to move your spine and pelvis in all the different directions. So I think, you know, any repeated pattern in our bodies is worth looking at. But I always say, you know, we can get real sort of strict about even lengthening the spine or having a flat back. But when you're going to pick ups, I'm sure you've seen those videos before. When there's something on the floor and you're going to pick it up, are you doing a hip hinge with a flat back and, you know, going all the way down slow? No, you're just reaching towards the ground to pick something up.
Yeah, it's not. I feel like sometimes we demonize certain movement, like the rounding the back is bad. But like you said, it's one of the essential healthy movement of the spine, right? Like flexion and extension and twist and side bend and lengthening, all of that is important. And I think hopefully in yoga classes, the way we teach it, we're teaching everything is a healthy movement.
Yeah.
And I think ability for us to be able to come in and out of those movement and shapes are important for our body. So important. And I think probably the most important part is cultivating awareness of like, what is your spine doing in this pose, that pose, or when you're sitting working at the desk, or when you're walking, or when you're driving, and if noticing the patterns and habits that exist in your body. And then if those patterns and habits are causing issues or problem or pain, then we can address it in yoga class on your yoga mat to like come out of that habits and try to recreate a new habit, and hopefully carry that awareness with you when you're off the mat in your day-to-day life.
Yes. And bring consciousness towards the things that are unconscious. You said that before.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. I think that's a good way to wrap up this week's podcast episode. We talked about the spine and pelvis, or we talked about the tucking or untucking, as well as sit bones and hamstrings. So I hope this was helpful to all of you listening, and we'll be back next week with some more cues.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed listening to Karen and I talk about yoga, anatomy, and we love to get geeky about yoga stuff. And recording this episode and editing it was actually really fun for me. I couldn't stop smiling as I was editing this podcast episode. So I hope it was fun for you as well. Like I said, if you are interested in joining me for Nicaragua retreat, that's happening July 12th through the 19th. It's a week-long retreat in northern, pristine, beautiful beaches of Nicaragua. I highly encourage you to check out my website for my retreat. It is an ethical retreat, so it's not only about practicing yoga in beautiful places, but it's also about giving back and cultivating relationship with the local community. I have one room left, and this room can be either a single, one person with private bathroom and shower, or it can be shared with 2 people. The cost will be different depending on which option you choose, but you will find all the information you need on my website. But you can also ask me questions if you have any questions about this retreat. I am pretty sure this retreat is gonna sell out, so if you're interested, I wouldn't wait on it. You can find all the information on the show notes. Last thing, if you could rate or star or review or comment on my podcast, that would be super amazing and helpful. Or most importantly, share the podcast with somebody that you think might enjoy listening. So if you have yoga teacher friends, or maybe it's your yoga teacher you want to recommend to, or maybe it's your coworkers. So share this podcast with whoever you think might benefit from listening to this podcast. That would be super appreciated. So that's it for now this week. I hope you have a great rest of your day and week. Speak to you next week.